Hi, welcome back to episode 2 of Mad in Germany, where we're picking up where we left off in our conversation with acclaimed author Deborah Feldman, talking about anti-Semitism in Germany, its similarities with Islamophobia, and her court case with author Mirna Funk. Stay mad. "69% of the German population, or even more, this was about a month ago, are in favour of a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire, and a lot of them want the German government to put pressure on Israel to reduce the violence in Gaza. Why is it that you don't see the need for that perspective in politics or in the media?
Because as I've said before, Germans have used this topic to set up a kind of exceptional political space in society where the general population doesn't get to have a say. So it's like the voters get to have a say in everything, but they don't get to have a say in this because the Holocaust means they can't be trusted to have a say, and they don't get to trust themselves to have one. And therefore, you won't see a lot of people in Germany taking to the streets and protesting the way you might in the U.S., because in the U.S., people trust their own moral compass. They haven't been trained to distrust it.
And they have a history of anti-war protests having been proven arguably right afterwards.
Yes, that's true. Germans do have a general historical insecurity in the way that they feel that if in the past their ancestors have committed wrongs, what if they end up committing wrongs too? And it becomes easier to just not participate politically at all out of fear of being morally wrong in retrospect.
Although Germany does have one of the largest peace movements in Europe, which was vocally and probably played a role in stopping the German involvement in the Iraq War, but then, of course, quite recently has been against giving weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah. So it's tough for me on that because, you know, I see the occupation and illegal annexation of Ukraine similarly the way I see the issue in Israel-Palestine. I see some connections there. I see a relevance to discuss the two together. And I am very pro-Ukraine because, I mean, if you're a Ukrainian, I mean, it's a nightmare. Imagine having to give up your freedom and your ability to think and speak and behave authentically and
to live under an authoritarian dictatorship.
Like if I had to live under Putin right now, that would be my personal nightmare. I mean, there are people in Germany who will say things like "Lieber rot als tot," and I'm like "Lieber tot als rot." Like I really just, it would be my worst nightmare to have to live under that kind of oppression. But at the same time, as I watch our own society, you know, turning towards authoritarianism, I'm like, oh God, like I don't know if we can really claim to be so much better anymore. I'm really nervous about this. I'm nervous about these trends. But
I mean, one thing that people have said to me, foreigners, noting the rather heavy-handed policing of pro-Palestine protests, the ban of saying "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" as a slogan, including even from the Risa chicken shop to the Spree River, there was someone who was arrested quite violently just for having that on a sign, which is clearly a joke. I was actually at an event recently and met some Russians, and they said, yeah, it reminds me of Russia.
Okay, so I have actually a different theory about that. I have a theory that it's part of performative power. So it's what I talked about. So, for example, we have Nazi demonstrations all the time, and
and they don't get stopped in the same way.
We have radical Islamist protests that don't get forbidden, and
true,
right?
There was 1,000 people calling for a caliphate in Hamburg recently.
Yeah. So the fact that those protests go off without a shot and then are sort of used in the media as ways to spin discourse in certain directions, whereas pro-Palestinian protests are greeted with such immensely disproportionate violence. And I believe Kai Wegner sent 2,500 policemen to the Palestine Congress. How many people were at the Palestine Congress? 250?
Yeah,
so how
250.
Many would that be per person?
Yeah, almost 10. I think it may have been 1,200 and 2,500 around the whole city.
So that's not like you. I mean, that's obviously not a normal response anymore, right? That's obviously something performative. Something is happening there that has nothing to do with the law or with enforcement of the law. It has to do with performative power.
And actually, there's been some leading jurists like Ralph Michels who has said that this was beyond the law, particularly the ban on Yaris Varoufakis, but also...
But is that exactly what they're trying to show us? Isn't that what they're showing us? They're showing us that they are beyond the law, that we have arrived at this place where we now need to be intimidated by their very performative showing to us that they are beyond the law, that the buck stops there.
And so I'm really curious about this, because when I report a lot on police violence in Germany, and when I post videos of it, there are always people who are saying this is just the Rechtsstaat at work. This is the rule of law.
Absolutely, but it's selective. It's the selective rule of law, and it's a selective interpretation of the rule of law.
And which law? And I'm also curious that, you know, a country with such a understandable valorization of the idea of a Rechtsstaat, because Nazi Germany was not a state of law, as they call it. It was an Unrechtsstaat. Why they are so tied to the idea of the Staatsräson, which doesn't appear in any single law. And after Merkel said it at the Knesset in 2008 at a speech, it was then immediately the Bundestag's Wissenschaftliches Dienst, the technical advisory service, said, this is political speech. It has no legal meaning.
So, you know that
is this a law beyond
Germany
the law?
Has a very unique legal principle around the Holocaust, right? We have like a law about Volksverhetzung, about incitement to racism. Mm-hmm. We have a law about minimizing the Holocaust, denying the Holocaust, and so on. And so the far right historically has always complained that, in a sense, this is a contradiction to the freedom to express one's opinion and so on. And they've always complained very bitterly about this. And I was present at a court case in 2015 where I encountered a Nazi in a public swimming pool who had tattooed a picture of Auschwitz on his body and then written the words "Jedem das Seine," to each his own, which was on the gate of Buchenwald. And it went to court. It went first to a local court, and the court sort of dismissed it as trivial, and then it went to a higher court, and he was sentenced to prison. But of course, the argument from his lawyer, who was also a neo-Nazi, was again the way that these laws, because the neo-Nazi lawyers try to use these cases traditionally as ways to call into question even the existence of these laws, criminalizing the denial of the Holocaust, so to speak. And so for decades, the far right was infuriated by this and was dedicated to undermining these laws. And what I think has happened is that we've experienced a shift in that approach in the last decade, where the far right has realized that actually, instead of trying to undermine these laws, they can use these laws as a precedent for creating similar laws that would undermine their enemies the way they feel undermined. And so in a sense, many of the methods that have been used to keep the right under control are now being used to keep the left under control. And the left is in a bit of a bitter position there, because the left has always been very much pro-controlling the right. And, you know, it's one of the biggest discussions in the left-wing community has always been as like, do you talk to Nazis or not? In German, you say mit Rechten reden. And there are left-wing people who will say, you know, I don't talk to Nazis, or let's forbid
punch them instead.
Yeah, or let's forbid the Nazi party. And one of the things I've always believed is that you have to, until the very end, until the person actually commits the crime, you have to be willing to talk to them, because I deeply believe in the power of human transformation based on my own transformation that I went through. And I believe that we must be committed to inspiring this transformation, and no one must be beyond redemption. No one, until they commit the crime, no one must be beyond the hope of redemption. And this makes me very controversial as well in left-wing circles, because all of the left-wing friends I have, if I ask them, do you want an AfD-Verbot? Do you want to forbid the party? And they're always like, yes, yes, yes. And I'm like, in what way is that going to be a solution to all these people who feel frustrated and angry enough to vote for the AfD? What are you going to do with all that frustration? That is not going to solve our problems. And
although interestingly, none of the big demonstrations were actually calling for an AfD-Verbot. They put it on the table, but
the big demonstrations were not really being led by the left. I mean, the people who demonstrate against the AfD in this country are usually what we would call centrists, people who vote for the Volksparteien. And these are not necessarily people who understand what they're really protesting against when they say gegen rechts. I mean, they know they don't want the AfD in power. They don't have any idea how to keep the AfD from getting power. They don't understand the ways in which the AfD has already infiltrated our political space.
Or controls the discourse.
Exactly.
I mean, for one example of this, the BDS Beschluss from the Bundestag, which was sort of a ruling that BDS is anti-Semitic and then we shouldn't be giving government spaces to it. It actually initially came from the AfD, which a lot of people don't realize. And then the FDP and the Greens said, no, we can't leave this vital work of fighting anti-Semitism to the AfD. So we're going to kind of make our own law about it. And that passed, and that's, some people point to that as being the beginning of when supporting...
The AfD started using the rhetorical tools of power around this issue.
But also when it became practically illegal to support Palestine.
Well, let's talk about that. So what does it mean to say that one supports Palestine? I support the right of all Palestinians to cultural and political sovereignty. I support the right of all Palestinians to live in equality, in security, with access to true justice. But I don't believe that this needs to come at the cost of Israeli safety and peace. You know, one of the most disappointing things for me in the past few months has been that BDS condemned the organization Standing Together. Standing Together is an incredible organization. It is grassroots. It consists of Israeli and Palestinians, as sort of Jewish Israelis and Palestinian citizens of Israel, who literally stand together and work toward change for a shared future, regardless of what that future might look like and might be called. But they understand that this future has both of them in it. And when BDS condemned this organization with the usual accusation of normalization, that was really hurtful and terrifying to people in the organization and to me. And it was also deeply damaging to the work that they're doing, because it's saying Israelis don't get to be a part of this. They don't get to be a part of this change. But I know really very, very many Israelis who do want to be a part of this change, who have incredible ideas about what this change could look like, ideas that are very just and very true and very morally upright. And these are the Israelis who are putting themselves on the line for their Palestinian neighbors, for their Palestinian brothers and sisters. I mean, these are people like Yuval Abraham, who gets on a stage at Berlinale and talks about the injustice of the circumstances that his friend and his fellow filmmaker lives in, because his filmmaker isn't empowered to do that. And so Yuval Abraham gets on stage and does it for him, which is, obviously on the one hand, a proof of the asymmetry and of the imbalance of power that the two of them have culturally. But at the same time, we do all need each other. We need each other in this fight towards a just and peaceful future. And I feel like what has happened with BDS is that BDS is determined to exclude the people born with only Israeli passports from this process of transformation towards justice and peace. And
particularly Israeli Jews, you mean? Because of course there are many, 1/5 of Israel are so-called Israeli Arabs.
But they're also trying to exclude the Israeli Arabs. They're trying to exclude the 48 Palestinians, and they're accusing them of normalization for standing together with their Israeli neighbors and friends and schoolmates.
Coming back to the Berlinale.
The BDS Beschluss, okay.
The BDS Beschluss, but also the Berlinale, that was, of course, where Claudia Horth, the culture minister, said, I clapped, but I only clapped for the Israeli, I didn't clap for the Palestinian. Does that say something about German Middle East politics and how it approaches the two-state solution? Is it always as defined by the Israeli state?
No, it actually says something about cultural privilege. It says something about the fact that the only people who have been empowered until now to truly speak about injustice against Palestinians have been rebellious Jews. They're the ones getting canceled, but they're still the ones even having an opportunity to get canceled. In Germany lives the biggest Palestinian community in the diaspora, and they have little to no visibility. And I remember that a couple of days after I went on TV in November to express my, in a sense, very non-radical views, which were seen as radical at the time, but which I don't no longer think are seen as radical, I had a reading, and my moderator was a prominent, very successful and influential German publisher of an important publishing house. And he said that one of the things that my TV appearance had made him think about was that he didn't know any Palestinian writers, that he didn't publish any Palestinian writers from this really large German Palestinian community, and how he had just realized that he knows so many Jewish German writers, and he can call 20 of them at any time because he's got their numbers in his cell phone. But when asked to find one Palestinian literary voice, none occurred to him. And he only just realized that this was actually quite egregious, in the cultural sphere. And it speaks to a level of cultural privilege that people have taken for granted. Just the fact that I am sitting here with you speaking about this issue is a sign of the fact that I have cultural privilege that Palestinians don't have, because if they had this privilege, they'd be visible, you'd know about them, and you'd be able to invite them to be the first person on your podcast, and everyone would line up to listen to them. But they don't, so I'm here instead. And I'm very aware of the fact that as soon as there is more visibility, it will also be my responsibility to step down from this platform and to give it to the people who deserve it to talk about themselves. But
Well, I also think you have a very unique perspective and voice. And it's also not just about to talk about Middle East conflict, but also about German fetishization of Jewishness, which is what your last book was about, costume Jewry or Jew-facing, as you put it. And I think that's what I'd like to talk about now, if that's okay with you. You mentioned Jewish writers. German Jewish writers. You recently had a bit of a legal battle yourself, didn't you, with Mirna Funk, who is an author who wrote Von Juden lernen, not mit Juden reden, but so that was reported in some quite different ways. The Udisha Allgemeine sort of made it out that Mirna won, but as I understand it, it was a bit more of a divided ruling by the court. They did say
she sued me on 6 points, and she won on 2. And the 1 point was very irrelevant. I had reposted something another person said, and the person had kind of listed a bunch of ways in which Mirna had lied about her history, and then used this to then draw a conclusion, which I am now forbidden to say, which is essentially reducing her entire personality to her lack of integrity. And therefore, I can identify lies individually, but I cannot reduce, her entire personality.
What kind of lies? That's quite a strong word.
Yeah. So one of the things that the post that I reposted talked about was, for example, that Mirna has consistently claimed to have a Jewish life experience. She claims to have grown up both in Israel and in Germany, and to have kind of been exposed to Jewish experience her whole life. And, we found a lot of interviews where she contradicts these claims, and she talks about how she only visited Israel very seldomly, and that she didn't know much about Judaism until she was an adult, and so on. So we kind of were able to prove to the court that these statements were not true, and that they can be seen as untrue.
And the court accepted that.
The court ruled in my favor. One of the questions was, how can you have an academic resume which claims that you went to high school here, that you went to college here, that you got two further degrees here, and how can you then still claim to have lived somewhere else while your entire educational background was accomplished in one place? So it was sort of these things. And I think the other accusation was that I put her in the light of prostitution because the person I reposted said that she had an OnlyFans account and talked a lot about anal sex, but those things are true, so it's okay, I can say that. But that wasn't the point of, I don't care if she has an OnlyFans account or talks about anal sex, but she wanted to prevent.
She made her name as a sex blogger, right?
Yes.
She wrote a sex column.
As a sex columnist. I don't think it got her very far. She complained that she couldn't earn enough money from this kind of work, which is why she opened the OnlyFans account in the first place, which I sympathize with. Being an artist is difficult. It doesn't earn a lot of money, despite the claims that people make about me. And, the center of our battle, in a sense, is that I claim that Mirna Funk abuses her Jewish identity, her supposed Jewish identity, for her,
for profit, effectively.
In a sense, to underwrite a representational role that comes with a lot of power and influence in Germany. And the irony is that Mirna has sort of made a name for herself in attacking other Jewish representational voices for doing the same thing. So famously, she has attacked people like Max Cholek for not being a halachic Jew. She has attacked people like Fabian Wolf, who discovered quite late in his life that he wasn't actually Jewish, although he claims to have thought he was Jewish. So she's sort of really become famous for being this person who will, go to the feuilletons, to the German newspapers, and write these scathing articles saying that these Jewish people are really Jewish. And I've always thought that was very funny because she admitted in those articles that she herself is not halachically Jewish. She wasn't at the time.
So she was
converted.
She converted.
The only thing is that I put her conversion into question because it's a really fascinating conversion. She claims in interviews that it's not an actual conversion. It's something called a Status Anerkennung. And this is something that actually only exists in this way here. So if you have the Vatican who makes decisions about Catholicism, in Judaism, there is something called the Israeli rabbinate, and they make decisions about, religious matters and often about civil matters related to religious matters. And they don't recognize these kinds of conversions. They recognize Orthodox conversions because Orthodox conversions are faith conversions. You convert because you believe. Mirna converted to have a Status Anerkennung, which means she converted to be accepted as a Jew, to be seen as a Jew.
But not with an Orthodox rabbinate.
No, she was converted by other converts. So,
But Orthodox converts?
No. So one of the most fascinating things about Germany is that Germany's Jewish community has a lot of converts, and these converts have very prominent positions of leadership. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the various synagogues that we have in Berlin are run by Germans who converted to Judaism. So you have the Pestalozzi-Straße synagogue, Jonas Sievers, who used to be called Gunnar Sievers, and he converted. And then you have Gisa Ederberg and the Raniburger Synagogue, which is where Mirna converted, who was a German and also converted to Judaism. But their conversions were what they call liberal conversions, so they're sort of pretty easy to do.
So liberal Judaism is a particularly German strain,
it's a German invention.
It's like Reform Judaism, but...
Not quite, no, because Reform Judaism is more progressive. Reform Judaism in the U.S. is drawing from the German tradition of Reform Judaism before the war, but having sort of developed it to a much more modern standpoint. Whereas the liberal Judaism in Germany right now is an invention of the rabbi Walter Hamolka, who is actually neither a rabbi nor a Jew, but that's a very complicated story. Walter Hamolka comes from an evangelical German family, and at some point he claimed to have converted, and he claimed to be a rabbi, and he became the most powerful rabbi in Germany.
He was given a prize by Merkel, wasn't he? So
prizes.
There's a very interesting piece about him.
In Airmail, really good piece. So Walter Hamolka, in a sense, invented this form of Judaism very conveniently, and he converted a lot of other Germans to sort of fill the system. And so it became this community that was in a way in competition with the Zentralrat, not in political sense, but very much in a sense of we have a new version of this religion. We invented it. And so in a sense, Mirna tried twice to convert the regular way. She wrote a beautiful article about it, actually, very, very moving, very emotional, where she talks about how it was too difficult and how she just didn't see the point. And she gave up after 2 attempts. And then, in a sense, especially coincidentally after her views began to align with the views of the German Jewish community.
They were pro-Israel, you mean? More or less.
I'll leave that up to interpretation. I leave it up to everyone to research her ideological transformation over the last few years. It's out there for everyone to see in the internet. And she was offered then this really unique, in a sense, discretionary decision of a Status Anerkennung, which is a way of the German Jewish community saying, we will accept you as Jewish. We will give you a certificate saying that you are Jewish, and you don't have to have a faith conversion, and you don't have to go through any real processes. It's just a really quick and easy, simple way. And she describes it as a much easier than the other 2 attempts that she failed to complete. And then she, in a sense, became Jewish in Germany. But in Israel, this conversion is not seen as a real conversion. And so I called her Jewishness into question, and she went to court, and the German court actually said that I can't.
So I'm really interested in it. I'm really interested in this ruling, in this case, because
I am too.
As I studied religious studies, and I think a lot of people know that for Orthodox Jews, Judaism passes down through the maternal line, And if it comes from the paternal line, then you should do a conversion, an Orthodox conversion, to be considered Jewish. From what I understand...
Let me interrupt you.
Yeah?
Because this is true, but I also see the injustice in this. It's not that I think that Mirna Funk is less Jewish because she's just Jewish through her father. I think she's just as Jewish as anyone else. But the thing is, I feel, based on my experiences in Germany, that many people who speak publicly about Jewishness don't have a lot of experiences in the actual Jewish world. Everything they know about Jewishness is transmitted to them through German culture or through the German perspective. And very often, it's easy to fall for the temptation of embracing a Jewish representational role because it gives you so much positive feedback. I know, because I performed that role for a while here and I enjoyed the positive feedback. But at the end of the day, it starts to really get at you, like on a soul level. You start to feel really...
It did with you.
It did with me, and I was perfectly ready to embrace being hated as the price to pay for being free of that sense of ick, of like always, catering to everyone's expectations about what Jewishness looks and sounds like. So in a sense, my beef with Mirna is that Mirna is a person who will passionately, argue the case for Israel's actions, even though she knows that Israel doesn't reciprocate this kind of loyalty that she's showing them. And the reason that she can still advocate for Israel's actions despite that lack of reciprocity is because it doesn't actually matter, because it's not about Israel. It's about the rhetorical power that advocating for Israel brings you in Germany. And this is going back to the entire line of argumentation that we have been following, which is all of this is about rhetorical tools of power. And so she needs the certificate to be able to occupy the representational role. I have no problem with her calling herself Jewish, but I wonder why she can't be honest about the fact that she is advocating for the actions of a country that doesn't reciprocate her generosity, and why she can't be honest about the fact that the only reason she's doing this kind of advocacy is because there is a clear system of reward for this right here. And even if Israel never rewards her for her work, it doesn't matter, because in Germany, it's already enough to be, in a sense, rewarded with all kinds of certificates and with all kinds of stages and with all kinds of, in a sense, positive treatment. It's actually quite groundbreaking that almost 80 years after the Second World War, I believe for the first time since then, a German has gone to a German secular court and has asked the court to confirm her Jewishness. The irony in that is tremendous. The country that created the Nuremberg laws, that, decided in a sense if Jews were Jewish enough to be persecuted, is now a country where Germans are asking German courts to do exactly that, to confirm Jewishness.
And what I thought was really interesting was that effectively they've made it illegal to express the Orthodox Jewish opinion, which is that if you haven't converted Orthodox, you're not Jewish. So in a sense, they've allowed the German state to criminalize, because if you were to repeat this, you would actually be sentenced to prison, as I understand it. Would
that be a great headline, though?
Well, I mean, maybe for a headline, but I actually think it's arguably quite scary, because there are plenty of people who don't consider this German status Anerkennung recognition to be halakhic religious Jewish.
Well, they can still say it. It's an einstweilige Verfügung. Only I can't say it. If they say it, she has to sue them separately, but she's not going to, because they're not as threatening to her as I am. The problem is that I am a Jewish person in the public sphere. She is a Jewish person in the public sphere. She feels that I described her Jewishness as not being as legitimate as it should be, she feels in a sense that I threatened her claim to a representational role. And since this representational role is integral to her career and her economic survival, she feels understandably threatened by this. And so she sued me. She's not going to sue everyone who, just when the IsraelGerman published the article about the court's decision, a bunch of people from the Jewish community commented and said, wait a second, what? The German court is now deciding he's Jewish? Like, this is total BS, right? We know.
I think that's Jewish. More interesting than
but she's not going to sue them,
dispute, right?
But she's not going to sue them because they're not out there in the public eye saying it to people who are listening. So, for example, there's a newspaper that is a competition to the IsraelGerman called the Udisha Rundschau,
which is run by the far-right owner of Tishy's Einblick.
Yeah, and the chief editor of the Udisha Rundschau is not Jewish.
Yeah, she's Kurdish, part Kurdish, right-winger, a former AfD candidate.
And somebody who proudly photographed herself hugging the alt-right figure Martin Sellner, who is also behind the plan for the quote-unquote remigration of minorities.
Ethnic cleansing of millions of people.
So, this is the editor of a Jewish newspaper who's a candidate for the AfD, who's, proudly photographing herself hugging Martin Sellner. So all this to say, even very conservative Jews in Germany, even Jews who support the right-wing government in Israel are very nervous about something like this. They don't love the fact that the Udisha Rundschau exists, but the Udisha Rundschau exists because there are also right-wing Jews. Many of them, by the way, are also converts. You have a lot of people in the AfD who are Germans who converted to Judaism, a lot of Christian Zionists and so on. Very famous one is Marcel Goldhammer, who actually served in the IDF, and he's basically the living embodiment of the Judenfetisch.
Quite an interesting character.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people who write for the Udisha Rundschau who are just right-wingers or Nazis who claim to be Jewish but actually never went through any conversion process. And so this is an uncomfortable aspect for the Jewish community in Germany, that this right-wing Jewish milieu exists and that it's really right-wing. And so recently, a very prominent personality named Kai Diekmann,
former editor-in-chief of Bild, which is a well-known best-selling newspaper in Germany.
He posted on Twitter about how he gave this interview to a right-wing newspaper. I believe it's called Junge
Freiheit.
Is that the right-wing newspaper? Or?
Pretty sure it is, yeah.
Junge Welt.
No, it's Junge Freiheit. Junge Welt is the left-wing one.
Exactly.
And then there's Jungle World as well, which is the anti-Deutsch.
So apparently he gave an interview to Junge Freiheit, which is considered a far-right newspaper. And in doing so, he somehow made a reference to the Jewish newspaper, but instead of saying the Udisha Rundschau, because it was reprinted in the Udisha Rundschau, he said the IsraelGerman. So he posted on Twitter. So the editor of the IsraelGerman replied to this tweet and said that you confused us. We would not reprint an interview from the far-right newspaper, Junge Freiheit. And the Udisha Rundschau is a far-right Jewish newspaper, and we don't want to be confused with them. And you could see that he was, he took it really seriously and that it was sort of hurtful. And, the response of Kai Diekmann was very flippant. And so a prominent conservative Jewish voice on Twitter reposted this conversation and said, I fear that now the people who are on the far right, as well as their enablers in the mainstream, are in a sense allying with each other. And this is concerning. And I reposted that because I agree. I've been saying it's concerning for a very long time that suddenly these barriers are dissolving, and people who would previously say, had draw the line at the far right are like, well, I'll talk to them. And they're legitimate.
We share some positions. That's what they call the Brandmauer between the firewall.
So I noticed that even people who they themselves were participating in this kind of enabling are now concerned that they're not the only ones doing it, that now Germans are doing it too. And this is the conflict at the heart of the Israel-German relationship, which is as Israel takes increasingly hardline and fascist turns, Jews may support those developments without necessarily wanting to support the equivalent of those developments abroad. And that's a tough juggling act. How do you support a government which includes a strong fascist position in Israel and claim to combat fascism in Germany? Can't. It's tough because essentially you're saying that I'm just going to make an exception, right? I'm just going to make an exception for Israel. Israel is going to be allowed to have these fascists in the government, but in Germany, we would never support a coalition with the AfD, right? But
by fascists, you mean figures like Smotrich?
Right? Netanyahu has built a coalition with fascist parties, and he has fascist ministers in his government.
I mean, if I remember rightly, Smotrich actually described himself as a fascist. This isn't the turn of phrase.
I mean, they're from the line of Israeli political ideology called Kahanism, which, was started
Meir Kahan
in the 70s. And
extremist rabbi who his followers killed a lot of people.
Called the Jewish fascism, right? I mean, it advocates for a theocracy. It advocates for the expulsion of all Arabs, even 48 Palestinians. So, I mean, it is a fascist ideology that also advocates for terrorism. And these are the parties that are in Netanyahu's government. Netanyahu has formed a coalition with them, and he has fascist ministers in his government. And, if in Germany we had the same, there would be an outrage. There would be an uproar. And even these Jews who support Netanyahu's government or who don't want to protest Netanyahu's government, for example, who just want to enable it, they would be horrified if the equivalent was done here. But that's an impossible contradiction. That is a tension that cannot hold for long. And as a result, the way that they're playing this is making it really easy for the far right to use them, to use these Jews who are stuck in this impossible contradiction and this tension, to, in a sense, mirror the developments in Israel in German politics. And some conservative Jewish people are starting to realize that. They're starting to realize where this is going, and they are scared. And when I reposted one of these Jewish voices, he immediately responded to me and said, oh, now you think my opinion is worth something. I was like, yes, because you're finally saying what I've been saying all along, which is that this is what we have to be scared of. This is what we have to be fighting. And I think that actually most journalists in German media do know this. When I speak to journalists I know, they listen to what I have to say and they don't disagree. But
do you think they feel they can't say it as Germans because of this historic guilt? Or is it more of a question of maybe careerism? They know that they would be cancelled or criticized heavily by figures like Volker Beck if they
sure,
out
everyone's
blind.
afraid of Volker Beck starting a shitstorm against them, although I think that this is having less and less influence as time goes by, and I think Volker Beck has got his own worries right now. But what I actually believe is that, yes, there is fear of standing out of the crowd, of making oneself a target, but there's a bigger fear, which is that if you name the monster, it becomes real. I think it's just a really general cultural fear in Germany that if we admit what is happening,
don't talk about
and it's really happening. Yeah. And I think that it's one of the hardest things for Germany to confront, right? There's nothing more difficult for Germans to confront than the fact that the right wing is back and that their power is increasing day by day and that we are enabling them and helping them in this journey. And as soon as we say it, it'll be real. And so instead, we do what the Germans call Scheuklappen.
Putting blinders on.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. If I don't see it, it doesn't exist. If I don't say it, it never happened.
Do you think this is something that's quite deeply rooted in German society? I mean, for me, one thing, there's a bit of a strange relationship with the truth in Germany, I've noticed, and people don't seem to mind if you've lied. There's this widespread phenomenon of people lying about their PhDs, but then there's also cases like this, like your case with Mirna Funk, or a well-known pro-Israel Palestinian commentator that I've had some run-ins with where, they've been proven to lie and it doesn't seem to damage them.
No, it doesn't damage. People who are generally in positions of privilege aren't really damaged by moral failings or, lack of character.
I wonder if that's more true in Germany than elsewhere, because I do feel like in the UK, we've had examples of politicians who've had to resign because they've been proven to lie. And I think integrity is quite an important thing seen as quite an important thing in our political culture, whereas in Germany, there does seem to, you do sometimes get the response of shrugged shoulders and, well, it wasn't that much of a big deal. It's like, well, this is someone who you're saying we should listen to in the public sphere.
Right. You're right that people don't expect integrity from their politicians, and that might have to do with a kind of deutsches Selbstverständnis, so like the German self-definition since World War II that...
we all did something wrong. Let's not look too much in detail at this, some might say.
Yeah, or like that no good can come of what our ancestors did, so why even bother having higher standards? Something like this, I think it's just really ingrained in German culture that we expect our politicians to be cynical, and we feel in a sense that by accepting this and by not trying to pretend it's different or demand anything different, we are in a sense being realistic, and we are being honest in the sense that we are honest about dishonesty. Like we are transparent about the fact that dishonesty is part of the culture. I mean...
But then there's such pride around certain political institutions like kind of memory culture, which has been, at least in the modern sense, very political since the reunification of Germany. It's kind of become part of Germany's brand for the world, actually. Yeah. The Stolpersteine, stumbling stones on the street.
No, the Stolpersteine is, you can't claim that the Stolpersteine is part of memory culture. There we have to draw an important distinction, because there are two versions of memory culture in Germany. And one is the state version of memory culture, which is very ceremonious and pompous and ritualized. But there's another version of memory culture in Germany, which is very much grassroots. It's very much happening on the ground in local communities. For example, where I live, my neighbors organized it so that on every lamppost there is a sign with a different Nuremberg law.
Wow.
So that when you take a walk with your dog, you can literally follow the chronology of the Nuremberg laws and understand how people were convinced to accept them, because they happened so incrementally that at every juncture you could say, oh, well, I mean, I can accept that. That's not such a big deal. And you don't see it cumulatively. So that's what I call grassroots memory culture, which I find quite sincere. It's usually organized by local inhabitants of a community, done, through private funding. It's very effective, I find. And Stolperstein is a really good example of how just random, regular people decided to get this started, and how it just took on a life of its own and is now all over Europe. But it's still regular, ordinary people who organize and fund it. So, for example, there are multiple Stolpersteine in front of my house. My neighbors were the ones who researched the histories, who contacted the family members, who funded the stones, who contacted the artists to prepare and lay the stones. This is not something that is part of the government's memory culture. This is what I call actually sincere memory culture. And it's very impressive, and it's very meaningful to me, and it defines my relationship to my community. The state government, the state memory culture is part of the system of rhetorical power. The state memory culture is about confirming the relationship between Israel and Germany. It's about confirming the relationship between politics and society. And it's about confirming what the Germans call Deutungshoheit, who has, in a sense, the jurisdiction to decide what memory means.
And are those generally Jewish people, or are they Germans, or is it this sort of symbiotic relationship between officially appointed organizations of Jewish people like the Zentralrat?
So here I want to very enthusiastically recommend the essays of Jane Kramer, written in the late 90s and the early aughts. I believe many of them are collected in a book called The Politics of Memory, or alternatively also The Europeans. And Jane Kramer wrote multiple essays on the development of memory culture as it was happening in the 90s and the early aughts. And she touched upon this very sore point in memory culture, which is that the primary actors within the German memory culture industrial complex are not Jewish. One very famous case was a woman named Lea Roche, who I believe brought back a tooth from Auschwitz. Do I remember this correctly?
Wasn't this one of the main supporters of the Holocaust Memorial?
Exactly. She was the primary proponent of the Holocaust Memorial, which was and still is a very controversial project in the Jewish community.
Interesting.
And Jane Kramer covered the conflict between her and her allies in the memory culture industrial complex with the actual Jewish community. And it's really fascinating to read when you really see early on that there is a struggle, a legitimate struggle between the actual Jews living in this country and the government, which would like to instrumentalize the memorialization of the crimes against them in ways that make the Jewish community very uncomfortable.
And make some members of the far right quite uncomfortable as well. Björn Höcke famously called it a monument of shame because it's also so close to the seat of government.
Yeah. So what I would say is that this memory culture is something that Jews originally didn't love, but they'd rather be part of it than stuck outside of it without any kind of participatory rights. And so with time, they have sort of submitted to the system of memory culture. But it's also proof that Jews have never really had a lot of say in how memory culture functions. And the only reason that they continue to act as part of it is because they're not really given alternative options.
So I think actually, if I remember rightly, this figure who was instrumental in setting up the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin did quite famously say that, the Jews need to listen to Germans on this one. When there were complaints, it was like, you need to be sensitive to what we want, which is, I think most people hearing that outside of Germany would say, hang on, you killed them in, an unimaginable crime. And you didn't do that much in terms of reparations or denazification, so it's disputed. And then you're telling them they need to listen to you? Shouldn't it be the other way around? That's what some people would say, right?
Like in Germany, nobody questions this because this is normal here and it always has been. Like the issue of Deutungshoheit in the idea of,
means like the authority.
Yes, the discursive authority in the process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Right,
which is coming to terms to your past.
Or overcoming the past, because bewältigen is to overcome something, to manage something. I mean, Primo Levi famously pointed to the root word of bewältigung, which is walten or Gewalt, which is also the root word of violence. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, doing violence to the past in a way. It's really, really fascinating. So the process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung has been something that Germany has managed to use as a way to reaffirm its discursive authority, to reaffirm its power, and in its power, especially in relation to Jews. So they use memory culture against Jews to make them submissive, to, in a sense, show them their place. And
do you think it's really about Jews, or do you think it's just about sort of German feelings in this one?
I really think it is about Jews. I really think it is about this vindication I mentioned earlier, which is, wow, look, we can actually use the supposed performative act of remembering our past to liberate ourselves from the past and to continue to oppress the people we oppressed then and technically are no longer allowed to oppress. I mean, it's just a really clever workaround. And I find it really revolting, but also really predictable and ordinary in many ways. It makes total sense to me that if a country were forced to reckon with its past in ways that no other country wants to, that it would at least then try to do so in a way that is actually only performative and not about real confrontation. Obviously, if you can get away with it, you will.
And I think one thing people forget is that this coming to terms with the past is quite a recent phenomenon, because German history was sort of defined in the Cold War by the two Germanys, the capitalist West and the socialist East.
Except for the 68ers, right? The 68ers, they rose up against their parents.
True. They talked about the Nazi infiltration of high officers of state, of the judiciary, police. But their focus back then wasn't really on the Jews. It was on the Nazis, right? So,
which is fine. That's where their focus should be. I don't think their focus should be on the Jews.
Because that leads to a fetishization.
Absolutely. They should deal with their past. They should deal with the fact that the Nazis came to power and that they need to understand exactly how that came to be and how they might be repeating those patterns later. I think that the 68 movement in that sense was also quite effective, because it did lead to a generation that really felt like it's their responsibility to break away from these patterns. But at the same time, memory culture essentially replaced that sentiment. It essentially created a kind of top-down, imposed structure of performance that had very little to do with internal developments of conscience, and much more with performative acts of self-delusion and Entlastung, relief, self-relief, or self-soothing, I would say.
Wow, that is really interesting. Your point about it replacing it. And of course, after the 68, you had the Historikerstreit later on, which was, today we're actually recording, by the way, on the Tag der Befreiung, the Day of Liberation, which commemorates when the Nazis were defeated. So I think it's interesting because this was something that was adopted in a way as part, this term and this holiday was adopted as a way of showing, we're not the Nazis, we were freed from the Nazi dictatorship. But then there have been voices who've criticized this and said, both from the far right and from the left, who've said, this was actually a day of defeat. We were defeated because we were the Nazis, and the far right would say it as a proud thing and say, it was bad, we were defeated. The left would say it's like, no, we were the bad guys. We weren't freed. Yeah, we weren't freed from anything. And this is what's really interesting to me. This sort of anti-Deutsch, we'll probably have a whole episode on that at another point, because it's a very interesting topic for me. The whole idea is that Germany has now, this idea of coming to terms with the past has put Jews and Jewish life in a really central position, but without necessarily very much knowledge of Jewish people. I mean, for me, I grew up north of London. I had a lot of Jewish friends at university, traveled to Israel a few times, studied religion. And so, I considered myself to be quite familiar, but without it really playing much of a role in my self-identity or anything, because why would it? I'm not Jewish. But then, there are tendencies and Germans who sort of identify so much with this without necessarily having much of a grasp on Jewishness. And we see that, I think, for example, Bild Zeitung gave a list of 50 ways to be German, something like that, ways to integrate. And one of them was, respect the Jews or turn against antisemitism. The other one was, we're a land of pork eaters, of Schweinfleisch. They explicitly put that. And so I've noticed a tendency, because Islamophobia, something we haven't really come up onto, I don't think we have time for, unfortunately, is very prevalent here. And some of the ways that people are Islamophobic are ways which actually are also anti-Semitic, because Judaism and Islam, everyone knows, or I thought everyone knew, have a lot of similarities.
Jews and Muslims are both targets of the far right. In that really famous case of the attempted attack on the synagogue in Halle, when the attacker failed to breach the synagogue, he then went to a doner shop and, in a sense, went in search of a Muslim, because his line of thinking was, if I can't find a Jew, at least I should find a Muslim. Historically, the right wing, the far right in this country has targeted Jews and Muslims alike. Therefore, many left-wing Jews feel that, in a sense, what is happening in Germany is an attempt to divide us and use us against each other in ways that will damage us both Jews and Muslims. Because when the far right in this country is done getting rid of its Muslims, you better believe it's going to be getting rid of its Jews. Now, Jews may argue that's okay, because then we'll go to Israel. But the question is, in what kind of Israel? And believe you me, I don't want to get to a point where this country is deporting me because I'm a left-wing Jew and I have nowhere else to go but a radical theocracy where I, as a woman, have no rights. That's not the future that I'm hoping to depend on if things go south.
Do you really think that's a possibility?
I'm saying that if we go down this road, if we allow the far right to rise on the basis of their alliance with the far right government in Israel, and if we allow them and their rhetoric to continue to overtake the center of our discourse and the center of our political culture, then we will end up in a country in which minorities will be increasingly marginalized and oppressed to the point where they will either want to leave or be forced to leave for some reason or another. And when Jews are forced to leave Germany, and Donald Trump is, let's say, president of the U.S., and Marine Le Pen or similar, Eric Zemmour is going to be running France, and, so on and so forth, if we have that right-wing wave in the West, that can very well happen, that seems more and more likely to happen, Jews are going to have no other place, technically, other than Israel. Now, I am of the opinion that at that point in time, Israel will say progressive Jews aren't Jews and we won't let them in. But even if they do let us in, they're going to be letting us into a country that they've remodeled as a theocracy where women's rights are essentially proscribed by the Bible, and where there will be no diversity in discourse and no freedom of protest and no justice the way we know it. So,
I mean, Israel does have rights for women now, right?
Well, they're more limited than in other countries, right? I mean, you can't really get a divorce as easily as you could in other democratic countries because the divorces are given by rabbinical courts, and rabbinical courts make decisions according to biblical law.
But without going too deep into Israeli law, sorry about that side topic, I wanted to come back to I don't know if you heard about this, but there was a case in Leipzig, which is quite a left-wing city, where there was a migrant LGBTQ housing cooperative that had hosted the Jewish Voice sometime after October 7th. And they were attacked by German leftists, self-proclaimed leftists. And one of the things that they did was they threw pig fat into the house because these people were anti-Semitic. So by hosting Jews. So I think there's something really questionable about that. And I do say that with some reticence as journalists because it's not my job to make judgments. But I do also think if you're fighting your self-proclaimed fight against anti-Semitism is targeting people for being associated with Jews and doing it in such a way that you're making this space not possible for religious Jews to enter because of the pig fat, isn't that actually just anti-Semitism?
Well, I mean, it certainly sounds anti-Semitic to me, but I would say, if I think about it deeply, that it's really just a sign of how little this has always been about Jews. It has never been about Jews. It has been about Germans and their feelings of dominance and comfort. All of my personal encounters with Anti-Deutsche have led me to believe that they don't actually want to know any Jews. They're not interested in Jews. They don't want to have a conversation with a Jew. They don't want to know more about a Jew. They're very happy to continue to invest in their very limited ideas of Jewishness that are, based in, German grappling with history. And again, the Judenfetisch. They would like to preserve their fetish. And very often when I meet them, what I experience is, in a way, the pendant, or the sort of the corresponding figure to the angry incel gamer in the basement. There's some weird vibe going on with the Anti-Deutsche. They're mostly men. There's almost like an antisocial element. Very often they'll show up at events, for example, and they'll troll the events. They'll interrupt, they'll boo, they'll get off, they'll make a fuss. I mean, there's a real vibe of discontent,
antisocial behavior, effectively.
Yeah. And so to me, when I see these Anti-Deutsche, I really see like a kind of alternative version of sort of like male frustration, and just another way to express that is a route to power and violence in a way.
That's interesting what you said about no interest in Jews, because there was quite famously an event that happened at About Blank, which is an anti-Deutsch associated club, although I think they would deny being that.
Oh, yeah. I remember this, yeah.
Yeah.
Invite a single Jew to talk.
Initially, it was called About Antisemitism, and they did not invite a single Jew to talk. Later,
why would they? Why would they invite a Jew to talk about antisemitism?
Well, I find personally sometimes they have a bit of a kern of a point to some of it. It's like they should have non-Jews talking about antisemitism. Maybe that's true.
Right, but why not any single Jewish person? Like, why exclude Jews from a conversation about them?
I think, that's a really good question. In fact, some members of the protesters outside were Jewish, and they said, you're creating Judenfreie Räume, which is what the Nazis did, Jewish free spaces.
Do you know what's even more interesting? Is that they're so aggressive in the discourse, especially against left-wing Jews. But they're not actually capable of sitting down and having that kind of conversation on a stage with a Jewish person.
Would you be willing to?
I would, anytime.
You're throwing down the gauntlet.
Absolutely. If any anti-Deutsche person, if any person out there who thinks that I'm like a threat, to their safety and to their, moral integrity, if they really feel that I, as the progressive Jew, am the threat here, I absolutely invite them to engage with me in sincere and a real conversation in good faith. I would be really happy, and also be really willing to listen, really willing to try to get into their shoes and really feel what they're feeling and see what they're seeing. Absolutely, 100% in good faith, I'm there.
That's super interesting. The gauntlet is thrown down. Deborah Feldman, thank you very much for being our first guest, maybe our second guest as well. We talked for a while. And thank you very much to everyone here helping. You've been amazing. That's all for this episode of Mad in Germany. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Deborah Feldman. And up next, we'll be speaking to acclaimed historian of the German-Israel relationship, Daniel Marvecki. He had some really interesting things to say, so stay tuned and stay mad.